Hello and welcome to the ThoughtWorks podcast. My name is Mike Mason and I'm one of your hosts, and I'm here with two guests today, Zhamak and Ryan. I'll ask them to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Zhamak Dehghani. I'm a tech consultant from our San Francisco office.
And hi, I'm Ryan Murray. I'm the director of our digital platform strategy team, and I'm also based out of our San Francisco office.
And so today we're going to be talking about strategic architectural transformation and all of the stuff that goes with that. The thing that I really love when talking about architecture is that everybody has a different viewpoint on what architecture even means. So if we're talking about strategic architectural transformation, Ryan, can you just give us 30 seconds on what you think that is? What is architectural transformation? Why do we need to do it?
Sure, Mike. I think there's a lot of ways to interpret architecture that are all valid. We do a lot of work with customers around architecture and platforms, and those words have meanings at lots of levels. At the level of strategic architecture, I think what we're really talking about is how broad systems interconnect within the enterprise to allow kind of the macro value proposition to be delivered. And that's across many teams and many different parts of the technology stack. So less about sort of technology details and more about how information and business capabilities are exposed and flow within the organization.
I almost wish you hadn't asked this question, because now we can spend half an hour talking about what architecture is. But if one lens to look at it is decomposition of the systems or the components at the application level or at the system level or at the organizational level. So I think under the umbrella of architectural transformation, we're talking about the whole ecosystem within an organization or within, sizable part of the organization, and how we decompose the capabilities that organization need to provide and implement that with different systems, and how those systems need to share information, share context, and utilize or leverage each other. So that decomposition of big pieces that are hard to change and expensive to change. I think that's the lens I would take for, at least for this conversation.
I think we wanted to talk a bit about the drivers for doing this. And Zhamak, you already mentioned one, which was difficulty in changing things. I think something that has always been an issue in software systems is being able to respond fast enough to business change. And certainly when we have kind of older, bigger systems, they tend to be slower to change. So I mean, change is a driver. Is that the only one?
Yeah, I think change is definitely a big driver, and speed of response to the change is the driver that we see with a lot of organizations, especially the ones that already grown to a sizable size, a big size, and then they've over the time with that growth, they've become slower and slower. So how can they now maintain that growth while become faster? So speed of change, but also the nature of change is also changing. Like some of the time in the past, maybe we see organizations that they experience the growth in the number of users or the market share that they have, and they need to respond to that growth quickly. In some cases, new parts of the organization being born, for instance, in the analytics space, that a lot of the practices and the organizational units are new. So within the organization, they're growing. So I guess the growth of the organization, and the speed of change are the two ends of the spectrum.
And Ryan, you when we were talking earlier, you talked a little bit about how those drivers are changing and impacting the way that we do architectural decomposition.
Yeah, I mean, I think to build on what Zhamak said first, as a way to lead into that, I think there's other factors that I'm seeing a lot in large organizations, different from sort of the digital darlings, if you will, are the importance of sort of business correctness. One of the things that I think a lot of organizations are struggling with is being able to have a capability, whatever that capability might be kind of factored into the right view of the different dimensions of the capability. So if we talk about, for example, like customer information as a domain, that's a very broad domain. And I think a lot of companies struggle from sometimes both of these problems of one is they've tried to be too monolithic in thinking about this thing called customer, when in reality, a customer has many different points in which it interacts with the organization, and from kind of establishing an account with an organization all the way through to transacting. And those are very different problem spaces. And when you do a kind of master data management approach, you can try to lump too many things together, which then really affects speed of change. But there's also the other side of that, which is when similarly customer may become too distributed across the organization, and then customers interacting with your organization across what Zhamak was saying, a lot of these different business lines that people are getting into, they don't have a cohesive experience of their relationship with the organization because they're actually, the architecture underlying it is fractured. And so I think those are two interesting, that's sort of the scope of the way we look at business concepts like customers or products or some of the other foundational things is a really big part of what we need to look at when we're thinking about strategic architectural change. Because again, there's this constant tension between, expediency versus correctness and flexibility. But I don't feel like we hear people talk enough about correctness, in the sense of customers don't like when their history with an organization suddenly through some channel isn't visible, or when the way they transact with the organization is different and inconsistent, right? Or they're not able to find things about their relationship with the organization. And so there's a really interesting tension between expediency of build and autonomy that we talk a lot about in the agile world, and then also having this kind of idea of correctness, and then being able to flexibly build things that are correct, but also build them quickly, I think is the big tension that architectural transformation or architectural design is really needing to focus on.
Yeah, I think what Brian says is really important. Like, we always talk about the main forces of change, speed and scale, and we forget the counter forces that need to kind of deal with that, which is things like integrity and correctness and security. So we compromise security, we compromise integrity when we go fast and when we go bigger.
Yeah, and organizations have very different, or let me say that customers have very different expectations of organizations. And one of the things I've been facing with customers recently more frequently is this idea of the mental model change that you need to make when you start to think about moving fast, the classic moving fast and breaking things. And of course, we don't want to actually break things, but on any given day that I use a Google product or I use some of the other large scale web products, I may or may not find a different user experience on that day. But most of those products I either don't pay for or I pay very little, and so I just fundamentally accept that as part of seeing that evolution and experimentation happening to me as a consumer is something I accept. But there are plenty of organizational situations in a supply chain or in a kind of business to business data exchange or commerce where that sort of unexpected change, it leads to significant business continuity problems. And so those are very different environments, and they need a different approach to architectural validation, and the meaning of speed and flexibility is actually quite different. And so knowing one of the things that we talk a lot about in our digital platform strategy practice is really looking at the architectural layers, and realizing that on a podcast, a diagram, would be helpful, but we don't have one. There's what you can do at the edge of your architecture where you're touching the customer through various channels like mobile or web or conversational, and the experiences that you're driving, there's a lot more room for experimentation and architectural kind of flexibility and even duplication than there might be in the level of the core systems like core customer management, core transaction or order management. And so each of those levels requires very different thinking about what transformation means and what scale and speed mean.
I would suggest that another difficulty is that all of the headline, interesting, buzzwordy, sexy stuff is coming from the digital darlings and the interaction points around the edges, because people can see them and they're sexy to work with. Whereas a lot of what we need to do is actually more difficult things than just building interesting UIs.
Well, a great example, Mike, of that I've been bumping into quite a bit now is, sort of API first, is obviously been a movement now for some years. And I think it's extremely important as a way of thinking about how to find those boundaries that Zhamak was mentioning earlier. And sort of APIs for me, I think of them broadly as an interface, meaning, transactional interfaces, whether they be REST or RPC style, also coupled with kind of event streams and how a domain advertises things that are happening within it. I think that's all part of a domain's boundary API. But one of the things that I see happening a lot now is as the API revolution is taken hold in the enterprise as well, is what I think might be a repeat of our kind of SOAP WSDL days of just, instead of really thinking about business transactions as the fundamental exchange documents the way SOAP started, I think we're heading quickly towards the automation that was created around around code generation led to just exposing kind of methods off of objects very willy-nilly and making them networked objects, and obviously all the dangers and problems that come from that. I feel like with APIs we're starting to see something similar, where a lot of the tooling is improving, but now organizations are getting kind of reports that say, hey, you should have an API strategy and you should build these 1,200 APIs. And looking at them, they all kind of look like RPC hidden in REST. And that's a great. It's going to be the SOAP problem all over again, where you've barfed out a lot of kind of low level functional detail, and you end up with a platform of APIs that actually doesn't get you any of the value that you were looking for in terms of flexibility, correctness, interconnectivity. You end up, with again just a new technological stack in the same tangle.
I think that's a really valid observation. I see that as well, but I think it's because defining APIs, finding the boundaries in the first place, and then defining meaningful interfaces that can extend and, they're developer friendly, consumer friendly, is really hard. It's the art part of the architecture, software design, and there's not so much science around it. So the tools will, drive the change, and the tools it's easy to just play with the tools and play by the rules of the tools, without really thinking about, what API should be exposing, how I should be decomposing, the landscape of the capabilities, and how can I evolve it? Because we're not good fortune tellers. However we decompose it would change. So how to build evolvability into it. And I think even us as a practice, we continuously try to come up with new ways of, principles and practices underneath this decomposition of the landscape and creating meaningful APIs or streams or boundaries.
Yeah. And I think I was just going to say, I think one of the things that exacerbates that is the fact that, there are a lot of uses of packaged software in the world, and in general, some of those things do not lend themselves to being modular and having well-defined boundaries around them. And in many cases, a vendor is economically incented to try to expand into as many pieces of your organization as they can, and so you end up with actually quite a lot of forces making it more difficult for you to draw boundaries and create decent APIs between things.
There's a couple of interesting patterns I think to call out specifically there, Mike, that I've seen over recent last 5 years or so. And one of them is the semantic problem that occurs when a vendor does try to expand into lots of adjacent areas, right? And that inevitably a vendor is also incented to make a product that's as widely applicable as possible. And so there's a really, that leads to that kind of semantic diffusion, if you will, the, kind of dumbing down of the product concepts to be flexible, if you will. And that flexibility doesn't lend itself well to understanding at a technology level. I've seen a number of cases where you end up with sort of data models that are highly generalized, with even things like, user-defined fields built into core, kind of entity models. And obviously, the expediency of that, I understand. Unfortunately, though, when it comes to people seeing payloads on the wire that start to expose those things, when it comes to, an organization trying to bring new people on and start to develop new capability, that kind of poor clarity about how a product actually works and kind of how it supports the domain, really, that's one of the aspects of not being able to move quickly that I think we don't think a lot about is, not just the inflexibility of code, but the incomprehensibility of the way capabilities function and the way they're wired together. And packaged software definitely creates a lot of risk in that space.
One of the clients I was working with recently, they were looking to expand their business model to directly facing the customer and not using the channel distributors and so on. And so they were looking at different packages. And when you look at just a simple commerce space or marketplace space, there are so many players, and they're almost none of them give you everything you need. You always have obviously custom software that you have to build, but they all overlap with each other. They all leaking into each other's boundary. So that's one problem. And then the other problem is they have very strong sense of data modeling that works for them as a packaged software. So a lot of the organizations end up adopting the internal models of those packaged software and leaking the identifiers, the internal data structures that they have into all other parts of the business. So for me, usually one way of validating if the way we've decomposed our systems is the right way is through coupling for building self-contained features. So if I need to build a new feature or a new capability and I need to change 5 systems, which pretty much communicate the same set of, reference data and identifiers across the communication, I've created a distributed monolith and a tightly coupled and a leaky system. So for me, one of the very simple tools to test the boundary or the suitability of the decomposition boundary is this idea of axis of change. Where change is happening, how, like looking at the portfolio of the projects and see what capabilities we're trying to build and how many systems do we need to touch for each of these capabilities to be implemented.
Oh, this is an interesting pet peeve of mine. Hopefully I won't digress here. One of the things I think is a solution path to what you're talking about when we talk about what does good modeling actually look like, and it's really easy to talk about things that we see not working. I've always found it valuable to try to, I have this terrible term called business truthful modeling, but this idea of, a box, if you're doing logistics, boxes have real physical characteristics, and representing those in software faithfully is really important, even if in an agile sense, I don't really care about all the dimensions of the box or its weight or its whatever right now. Taking the time to model the box as it really is I find really valuable to that kind of future state. When you try to do something new, in the end, the business typically changes along the lines of what the real physical value creating things are. And if you've taken the time to model them a bit faithfully, as opposed to the least kind of minimal work that you can do from an agile point of view, I find that you often get less of that problem of having to change across multiple systems. Because one of the ways you can, maybe I should have said this first, was one of the ways that you create change across multiple systems is simply because the systems aren't complete. And that's different from what you're talking about, I think, in the boundary sense, right? Of like, I have a distributed monolith because the concepts are spread across multiple parts of the system. There's also the systems are just incomplete. And so every time I need to do something new, I have to go back and expose a thing that the system might have exposed a long time ago, but agilely speaking, it wasn't needed. So I'm seeing that a lot also where we're touching multiple systems, not because they're confused, but simply because they all need some small amount of change to bring together the new value proposition. And I don't know it's completely avoidable, but I do think taking the time to model things faithfully to the business and exposing things that maybe don't have customers right now, but are intrinsically valuable to the capability or to that asset, is actually worth doing. Because while people talk about, you're not going to need it, I was just having this conversation with a colleague today about there was a field that represented a membership type and when they exposed membership, that wasn't a needed thing, but they exposed membership as an asset. And it would have been trivially easy to expose the membership type the first time they did the development. However, it required a number of teams to be coordinated to add that field later. And membership type is just this intrinsic concept. And so there's an interesting balance there of, I know agilely speaking, you didn't need it, but at the same time, it was virtually free to have just exposed it. It is part of membership. It's critical to somebody. And so, you don't get, I talk about serendipity, like great architectures, I think, enable serendipity because people can see what the core capabilities are and what the assets are, and they can imagine new things they can do with them. If you don't expose those things effectively, then that kind of serendipity doesn't occur. So I think that there's another interesting dimension of kind of how agile architecture and how agile practices also affect, future change.
I'm definitely going to take this down a rabbit hole now. You said something that I've been really thinking about recently because I came from a client that was a post-startup. So the hacker culture was, very dominant. And I started thinking about this spectrum of local optimization versus global optimization. So a lot of the kind of hack it, get it out there, see if it works, or maybe some of the agile methodologies fall into the end of the spectrum that is optimizing locally, optimizing for now, optimizing for what I'm building, this local feature that I'm building. And a lot of the, I guess, waterfall-y and traditional way are leaning towards the global optimization. I'm going to optimize for the next 10 years. Nothing's going to change. And I'm going to optimize for all of the organization and all the architectural patterns that I'm going to see. And I'm hoping we can develop a set of pragmatic kind of guidelines to see what is the right, how do you find the right optimization point? Like what you mentioned as an example was design for the business truthfulness. Is that the term that you use? Design for the thing that it is, that we know it is and physically exists. Maybe this is one of those guidelines. So having a few of those guidelines to find the right place on this spectrum of local optimization versus global optimization.
Yeah, a shameless plug. We have a good insights article on the ThoughtWorks website that talks a little bit about some of these concepts. But yeah, I think we can do a lot more to do that. And I don't know if it's a gear change, that it's the wrong time, but I think that one of the other challenges that I'm seeing in a lot of established organizations that aren't digitally native is the separation between the technology organization and the business. Really makes it difficult sometimes to have these conversations and to make the right investments in the way that you're talking about between global and local optimization. Again, there's a lot of disillusionment, if you will, on the part of the business with the speed of IT in many organizations. But that unfortunately compounds this kind of expediency, local optimization thinking. And I know the version you're talking about, I think, is more in the kind of the developers' heads to some degree, but there's also that project pressure that a lot of people face as well to just, you take too long, get things out the door. And doing strategic architecture transformation, it really is a partnership between the business and IT, or it needs to be, because the business architecture and the technical architecture obviously need to really mirror each other to create that kind of flexibility and serendipity that we've been talking about. And getting to that is a business it's a business facing business value investment that you need to make. You can't hide strategic architectural transformation effectively in other work. Everyone, people often try to do it when the business doesn't understand the value of it, but it rarely succeeds. In fact, you've talked about this a lot, Zhamak. Like sometimes you make the world worse in the process of architectural transformation, or in fact, you always make it worse for a short period of time. Making the world better again is the part that gets left out a lot. And so I do think that there's a lot to be said for technologists being much more conversant in the language of the business and being able to explain the importance of and explain how you will visibly see the results of architectural transformation so that it becomes a shared concern. And now I'm probably rabbit holing, so I'll cut myself off.
Well, I don't think it's entirely a rabbit hole because it's a common problem that people run into when they're talking about doing software. And I feel like we as technologists have not always covered ourselves in glory when it comes to asking the business to spend money on something that is, mostly a technical thing. And then being surprised when we, don't particularly produce outcomes a couple of times. And then the next time they're much less willing to spend that money. I think we are starting to see organizations understand a bit more that you need to do a kind of a constant investment in the technical health of your systems and architecture.
I think the language that Ryan mentioned, developers understand the business domain and design around that. So we had the kind of the movement of domain-driven design that introduce that concept in a more systematic way as how developers can, collaborate with business, design the technology around the domains. I feel while we've moved a little bit forward in that space in the operational landscape, but in analytical world or in areas where we are still technology is very new, a lot of the technology. So technologists are hyper specializing around the tool and a technology that the language of business gets diluted and forgotten. As an example, like in the operational world, we had the hyper specialization around database. We had the database as a layer, DBAs, they only talk about database language. And then we have the business domain layer or the business process layer and UI layer. And techies were just hyper specializing around the technology. And then the business concepts were just cross-cutting across different layers. And it was just so hard to change anything. Because I think the data engineering is kind of catching up, or the analytic world is now in the early stages that we don't have a lot of cross-functional teams or cross-functional individuals. We have hyper-specialized people. I see the same patterns repeating there. Whenever I talk to our kind of data engineering clients or projects, they always talk about, we have some sort of ingestion services and cleansing services, and this kind of layering architecture that existed now exists 90 degrees flipped in a pipeline, in a data pipeline. And when you talk about tell me about the data, tell me about the business concepts, the vocabulary is very poor. Like you exhaust the vocabulary very quickly just because people don't think about them so much. We think about the functional aspects of data processing pipelines. And I'm hoping that notion will kind of come to the analytical world and the data engineering world as well.
It's interesting, Zhamak. I think what you're pointing out is really important. Like whenever the technology problem is hard, that we focus a lot on solving the technology problem. And I would argue that databases for sure, and maybe some of those other layers were like that, right? Like data it's sacred. We all know that. And so we had people really specialized to make sure that it was, in the end that we were being safe and transactionally correct and all those other things. And so I wonder if we have an opportunity to recognize that and make sure that we keep the semantic importance of the data present as we evolve our technology ability to deal with the incredibly large volumes. Because I definitely see the same type of problem, but honestly, I actually don't think this is a new problem. I've seen this with business intelligence groups for years, which is, they get the data out of the transactional systems and then they remodel it for business, for business reporting. But what's always fascinated me is how often the modeling that goes on mirrors the upstream business. Like you're reporting on the same business that is being transacted. And that may sound silly, but I can't count the number of organizations that have two independent groups that are managing the transactional systems and the analytical systems, and they're both modeling, and they're modeling the same thing fundamentally, but they're modeling it in different ways because of those subtle local optimizations you talked about for their needs. And I've had some success in the past with really trying to, unify that understanding of the business models so that having those teams work together so that the upstream teams model in a way that's more, not global, but broader, so that the data that actually does transit down to the analytical systems is already in a shape that needs less restructuring, so that the ownership and understanding is both shared, but also kind of more single sourced, if you will. I feel like there's, with kind of modern event streams, we're seeing another opportunity to think that way. And making sure that our events are true, rich business events that fully reflect what's happening in the upstream, but that are also adequately able to be used by the downstream for analytical and kind of, predictive purposes. There's a lot to be said. And I think we're seeing some good stuff out of Confluent and stuff around, kind of the event registries. And these things are quickly bringing the event-driven architecture world along with the kind of the API world of having good documentation and thinking about those things as first-class interfaces. But again, to your point, we're still very focused on emerging the tech for that. I don't know that we're having enough conversations about what does it mean to build event streams of things that are business meaningful. And that's especially challenging because some of the event streams, when you're talking about like IoT devices, incredibly high velocity telemetry, sometimes that isn't possible. So there's also different worlds that you optimize for, right? And I get a kick out of how complex the world is becoming. And there really are no principles that are kind of universally valuable anymore, or they're becoming fewer.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like the even in the data world and the event stream world, the services closer to the consumption are easier to model around kind of business concepts and domain concepts. The sources, the data, the services closer to ingestion, whether they're devices, mobile applications, they're sending a lot of metrics about all the different types of applications, all the different types of interactions. And because of the volume and still technology catching up with the scale of the data that it needs to deal with, they opportunistically, mix and match domains to kind of enrich the data or cleanse data. So the boundaries that are kind of more clear on the consumption side, as in the business consumption side, becomes leakier on the source ingestion side, because of the volume of data. When you get it opportunistically, you want to do all those big joins across different data sets and do enrichment, and that has its own problems and challenges.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm interested to experiment more with is having more well-defined ownership of the enriched data, because more oftentimes that data is being enriched because fundamentally, again, there's a business concept that's either somehow the upstream systems are fractured in a way that maybe isn't actually even ideal, or they're simply macro observations that you can make across kind of core domain entities, core capabilities. But either way, it feels like a lot of what we talk about with the upstream systems around long-standing ownership of a business capability. I feel like long-standing ownership of aggregate data sets is also really important. And I've seen a couple of organizations starting to do this well, of really defining clear business data ownership and stewardship, so that we don't get as much of the bending of things to the technical need, but much more keeping that, seeing that aggregate as itself a genuine business concept. I think there's a lot there that is, when you have, because the technology is so challenging, you have like that tendency to have the data group with the data experts who kind of end up owning the data lake. And it seems very clear to me that some of the large organizations I've worked with that are doing this well have gotten it right when they make sure that there's still business ownership of every aggregate concept in the lake, and that it's not a technical enterprise, but it's a fundamentally business focused enterprise. And I think a lot of the things we talk about in our digital platform strategy team is really about technology capabilities and how they support business capabilities. And so keeping that separation and saying how you move data at scale, whether, with a streaming technology, or how you think about data lakes and data lake design, are technology enablers to something else, which is fundamentally a business concept, right? And if it's not a transactional capability, but an analytical one, that's fine. It still needs to be driven from that business lens. And so setting up teams with product ownership that's genuinely business focused is something that feels like it's bringing a lot of people success in keeping them out of that data swamp, but it's early days.
We could now go down the rabbit hole of product ownership for data.
Well, another interesting thing that I've been noticing in a couple of our clients recently is, because like with our platform work, we've kind of standardized enough things that we're able to get in and start moving technology, like this architecture transformation and some of the delivery infrastructure transformation faster than we have in years past. And that what that's done is like technology has kind of quickly unlocked capability or been on the verge of unlocking capability, and business owners are just not ready to move at that speed. And I know we've all seen this, but now it's starting to become this repetitive pattern where the business actually needs to now learn to interact with the technology organization in a much quicker and much more incremental way than they're used to. And that's been interesting, of like, again, looking at some of the larger digital organizations whose product owners fundamentally recognize that, they're wielding technology to create the business vision, and they either have strong partnerships with technologists to do that, or they themselves have enough background. And there are a lot of more traditional organizations, it seems like the crisis of business leaders not being tech savvy is becoming very acute.
Well, I'd like to thank both of our guests today, Ryan and Zhamak. Thank you both for being on the podcast. This has been very interesting to me. And I hope everybody listening enjoyed it. If you did, please leave us a review, because that helps us expand the audience and have other people find the podcast. Thanks very much. We'll see you on the next one.